Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer Fantasy lore. Where today we're going to talk about that one time that Averland decided that the only solution to the Halfling larceny problem was genocide. And seeing as the only halfie guaranteed to not steal anything is a dead halfie, I view that as a thoroughly reasonable reaction from the much defamed mad cunt of Averland. Or count, depending upon who you're speaking with, Marius Leitdorf. Now, to be fair, this isn't the first time that somebody's thought the thought of wiping the shorties off the face of the old world, but very rarely has anyone ever acted upon the understandable impulse to such a scale as the elector Count of Averland, who set out to correct the mistake of the 11th century, the creation of the Mootlands in the first place, during the middle of the year 2502, imperial calendar, of course. But as is so often the case, the elector Count's sudden desire to dispose of the dumpling people forevermore was not caused by a entirely rational and understandable bout of intense racial hatred of a species that grow as much horizontally as vertically, but rather due to the malfeasance of the midget men. You see, trouble was brewing in the year 2502 on many an arena, both within the Empire, which was currently undergoing an imperial election, a enormous event, of course, as it would determine the entire future of the Empire as a state and as an entity in the old world, and also because of a growing threat of greenskin invasion into the southern provinces, which, during a period where there was no actual ruler of the Empire, could quickly grow into a very large threat indeed. Now, Marius Leitdorf, the so-called, and honestly, unjustly so, mad elector Count of Averland, had an eye on the latter threat, even as he was also concerned with the former. You see, a fairly large tribe of goblins was beginning to gather in the World's Edge Mountains under a warlord named Nahobgarg. His goblin hordes had already begun to raid outlying villages in Stirland, and there was real danger that if he was allowed to fester, then he would grow into a large and powerful warlord, gathering yet more goblins and greenskins in his ranks, which would in turn only see his threat grow, and his ability to raid as well, which would in turn draw even further green-skinned creatures to his banner. But Stirland alone was not really ready to deal with a greenskin invasion at the moment, especially during a time of political turmoil as this was, as Stirland remains the primary bulwark against the so-called vampire counts of Sylvania. They need to maintain a steady watch upon that long-lost province forevermore, lest their borders be overrun by significantly worse foes than goblinoids. Keenly aware of the danger, Marius Leitdorf therefore suggested a direct alliance between Averland and Stirland, where Averland would march an army to Stirland's aid, and Stirland would only be required to provide guides and light reinforcements, whilst Averland would make up the majority of a campaign into the World's Edge Mountains, with the aim of crushing the threat of the goblin warlord before it truly became one. The elector Count of Stirland, Albrecht Haupt Anderson V, immediately agreed to the proposal. He would provide scout and support elements, which would guide the heavily armed and armored Averlanders into the mountain. They would help them find the main goblin base and crush this menace in its infancy. But there was, of course, a problem. The most likely holdup for this goblin warlord was somewhere in the vicinity of the Black Water or the Haunted Hills. It would be relatively easy for Stirland to dispatch forces from its protective duties against Sylvania towards the Haunted Hills and the Black Water. It would be significantly harder for Averland, who would either need to cross the River Aver near their capital of Averheim, and then march a long and circuitous route northwards into Stirland, and then northeast all the way up until the border with Sylvania, before turning south towards Bjolhorf and the massive marshes outside of its borders. Only from there would they be able to march into the Haunted Hills and further south towards the Black Water. This approach would not only take weeks and weeks of marching, but it would also place a severe strain on Stirland, as there would be no way for the Averland army to carry enough supplies with it for the entire march, not to mention the return journey, meaning that Stirland would have to feed and house all of these Averland troops on their circuitous journey. The far easier solution would be for the Averlanders to cross into the Mootland, and then directly into the Haunted Hills and towards the Black Water. This would massively cut down on the travel time, possibly by as much as 2/3. However, the issue now was that there wasn't all that much in the way of solid infrastructure in the Mootlands. Certainly not of the size and the complexity required to service an army with all of its carts and heavy supplies. It would need to be constructed. The Averland Army Corps of Engineers, however, were confident that they could do it. At the very least, good enough to get the Averland army to where it needed to be and back home again. Furthermore, this would also allow Averland to establish supply depots along the way to ensure that they had plentiful resources to deal with any unfortunate setbacks or to handle the need for potential reinforcements. There really wasn't a whole lot of downsides to the plan at all, not so long as the engineers were confident in being able to create the roads and throw up the bridges required for the army's traversal of the various rivers in the region. Tragically, the Mootland was not considered a part of Averland. Yet again, a terrible consequence of the error of the 11th century. Therefore, the elector Count of Averland technically had no right to carry out any building operations, no matter how beneficial to the locals, in the Mootlands. Obviously, the roads would be hugely advantageous to the local populace, largely farmers, that needed to bring the vast majority of their crops to the regional capital of Eichschatten. This was, of course, the first and foremost point presented by the Averland diplomats when they visited the Mootlands Council of Elders, the ruling bodies of the Wee Men, led by Hismer Stoutheart, the eldest of the Elder, and the technical elector Count of the Mootlands. Now, the stunted people vote for their electors, rather than having it be a hereditary position like most of the reasonable parts of the Empire, though it might as well be a permanent one, as Hismer Stoutheart has been re-elected in the last 10 elections, despite, or possibly because of the fact that he really doesn't seem to give a shit about the government of the Mootlands, preferring to retire to his countryside estate, where, as he would put it, a body can get some practical work done, and have the benefit of one's own outhouse. However, whilst the Mootland elders and Hisma might not have much of an eye for political intrigue or the power struggles so popular in the rest of the imperial courts, they are, in their hearts of hearts, still greedy, weasel-souled leprechauns. And so the council immediately demanded an exorbitant ransom in order to allow the big men to build them roads. Now, this wasn't entirely unexpected, of course, as the Averland diplomats had already been honored on multiple occasions by having their packs picked through by thieves. Why, therefore, should the government officials, traditionally the biggest thieves in any civilized society, be any different? Having received then the pygmy's blood price, the diplomats returned back to Averland, where they informed Marius as to the costs of his humanitarian mission. Marius was not overjoyed at hearing this news, although he himself, too, having repeatedly taken a rather dim view of the diminutive neighbors of Averland, was probably also not entirely surprised. He took counsel with his advisors, including, of course, his most trusted and reliable of counsel, Daisy Kurt von Hellboring II, who just also happened to be his horse, and who also just so happened to be named after the Emperor's champion, Kurt Hellborg, of whom Marius held a particularly negative view, having compared him on multiple occasions to a river troll in terms of intellect, hygiene, and sense of humor. Regardless of these curious coincidences, however, I imagine that Daisy Kurt von Hellboring II's advice was, nay, pay the goblins in all but name, nay. It'll be much easier to simply appease the bitches, nay, even if they are walking, stinking avatars of nature's greatest mistakes, nay. Thus convinced, Marius elected to go along with the Mootland elders' demand, sending back an enormous bribe in the form of both gold and roasted animals. Presumably, another suggestion by Clara, no doubt, understanding the filthy heart of a halfling better than any human ever could, being, of course, herself far closer to the beasts that the little half-foots so resemble. And, admirably enough, the Mootland elders appeared to be sticking to the treaties. The Averland engineers were allowed to enter into the Mootland and begin the construction of vital infrastructure for the moving of armies. This would naturally include the construction of several bridges. The first one would be near the town of Beeswang, crossing a small tributary to the River Ava. But the crucial one needed to be constructed a little bit to the west of the Mootland capital, Eisschatten. Now, many sources have erroneously claimed this to be the River Steer, but that is, of course, an impossibility, as the River Steer lies far to the north of the Mootlands. So clearly, this is merely some mistake on behalf of the historians documenting events, as the river that needed crossing, with a massive top-of-the-line stone bridge, was of course the River Ava, running through the Mootlands. This was, of course, going to be an enormous engineering challenge. The River Ava is, for the majority of its winding path, hundreds of feet wide, especially in this location, as the River Ava is fed by one of its main tributary rivers, the Blue Reach, coming down all the way from the World's Edge Mountains. But this was no deterrent for the Averland engineers, who knew exactly how to tackle this challenge. It was just a question of getting started. The engineers created a number of massive wooden cranes. These would be used to lift and move the massive cut stone blocks that would be sunk down into the river to form the fundaments of the bridge. Once one pillar was created, then another one could be made, and the work on the bridge proper could begin. The army engineers retreated after a day of good, satisfying labor, only to return the next day, having found all of the rocks they'd sunk into the river, having been knocked over, removed, or otherwise sabotaged. Expecting that mayhaps they had underestimated the river's flow, the engineers sunk more rocks that day, making sure that they were more properly situated so that the current couldn't possibly ruin them or drive them away. Yet again, retiring to camp for the night, they returned the next morning to find yet further evidence of, this time, blatant sabotage. Somehow, someone had managed to dislocate the fundament blocks yet again. An impressive feat, considering that these would have been huge stones sunk deep into a river with a rapid current. Understanding that something weird was clearly going on here, the engineers then started posting sentries to watch over their work. And for a few days, work proceeded apace, until the sentries started disappearing and the sabotage started reappearing yet again. The sentries were discovered a few days later, hog-tied in a ditch. So at least they hadn't been murdered, which seemed to preclude the involvement of any greenskins, even if we'd somehow leaped to the conclusion that the greenskins would have had the intelligence required to sabotage the bridge in the first place. Hell, it would be a massive leap of logic to even assume that a greenskin knew what a bridge was, never mind how to ruin one. The little arms race between the engineers and the saboteurs continued for some time, but it was clear that the engineers would never be able to build the bridge in time with all of these constant setbacks. Annoyed, they went to the elders of the Moot, arguing quite vehemently so that in all due likelihood it was the Tom Fiddle family, a massive clan of little furry-footed savages that operated the local ferry, and would therefore be put out of business were the bridge to actually be completed. Expecting the elders to actually honor their deal was, well, the first mistake the engineers made, as the elders simply said that, well, the deal was for the creation of infrastructure, roads. We never approved the building of any bridges. Obvious nonsense, as the elders had been informed of the precise goal of this infrastructure project in the first place. But seeing no hope of completing the bridge in time, the engineers now sent a message back to Marius Leitdorf, informing him both of the delay and the cause for the delay. The mad count flew into a rage, and this time, I imagine, his favored counselor gave him an entirely different piece of advice from last time, probably going something along the lines of, "Nay, kill them. Kill them all, Marius. Spare not even the women and the children, Marius. Nay." And so the Averland army's first target was not going to be the goblins after all, but equally dishonorable and short creatures, albeit with a different skin tone. As the Averland army crossed over the border into the Moot and invaded. And it quickly became obvious that this was to be a punitive expedition, with the Averland army raiding the countryside and burning villagers and stealing crops wherever they could. The Averland soldiers got a rich booty during the opening days and weeks of the campaign, as the Moot, for all of its many failings, is a rather wealthy province of the Empire. Now, the elders of Mootland organized their own army in an attempt to repel the invader. You might be wondering whether or not the Halflings even have an army, and, well, they do, sort of. Like all provinces of the Empire, the Mootlands is expected to maintain its own standing militia of state troopers. And whilst the Halfling do their damnedest to dodge, evade, or otherwise avoid this duty, they do still have state troopers in the form of a Halfling militia. These are usually organized on a village-by-village basis, and their stated numbers usually outstrip their actual numbers by a rather significant margin, probably because whoever is organizing the militia gets paid per active member of the militia. And the Halfling elders rarely decide to check on the exact numbers involved. A lot of these militias are organized around large groups of archers because, well, it's a decent excuse to get a bow, and Halflings do love hunting, and they are also exceptionally skilled archers. In fact, Halflings, much like the things they ripped off, are surprisingly keen of eye, capable of hitting targets at significant distances with virtually any projectile. Give them a bow or even a crossbow, and they simply become even more deadly. However, as there are very few crossbows in the Mootlands due to the complexity of their construction and maintenance, they are usually only equipped with bows. And since recurve bows are practically unheard of within the Empire, that means that all they've got is straight bows. You know, the bows whose size is a direct corollary to its power, wielded by a Halfling. Yeah. It's adequate for hunting your birds and light game, but fully armored Averland halberdiers is a somewhat different matter entirely. There are also some more professional fighters. These are usually the bodyguards of elders or cooks. No, I'm not joking. One of the elite fighting forces of the Halflings are literal chefs. Although on military campaign, they adopt the moniker of pantry guards. These, shock troopers are assigned with the most important duty in the Halfling army, the safekeeping of the chuck wagon, or rolling kitchen in layman's terms. The only other forces that could be considered, military-esque would be the field wardens, who are, well, the Halflings' variant of an extra racist police force that patrol the Mootlands in order to get rid of large people, or their various forms of cavalry, including such ferocious formations as warsheep riders, goat riders, swan riders, and battle ram riders. Now, to be fair, battle ram rider that does actually sound like a reasonably effective form of cavalry. It's going to have a hard time against actual cavalry, but I can at least see that inconveniencing infantry significantly more than a sheep. And battle mounts is not the only role that literal livestock fulfills in the halfling army either, as they've also been known to drive swarms of pigs or poultry towards the enemy, in the hopes of, I presume, breaking their formations. This traveling carnival mobilized in the halfling capital of Eichsudden and set out to meet the invading Averlanders. Armed and armored for bear, of course. Averland is one of the richest provinces in the entirety of the Empire, and is charged with the safeguarding of Blackfire Pass, one of the most often used invasion routes into the Empire, and a site of some of its most famous battles. Averland state troopers are luxuriously equipped with armor and arms, and their most famed formation are heavy, full-plate armored halberdiers, all the better for dispatching the countless lumbering beasts that occasionally descend on the Empire's southern borders, or hordes of heavily armed greenskins. And Marius Leitdorf, which was leading the army in person, despite his occasional eccentricities, is a martial genius. And a genius in many other ways as well, as he rarely, if ever, does anything without a very good reason. Bear that one in mind for later. The Averland army is, in other words, a well-organized, tough, well-equipped, well-led fighting formation that would have organized this particular expedition with the express intent of invading the World's Edge Mountain, hunting down a goblin warlord in his strongpoint, and then assaulting that strongpoint straight up. This would be a formidable army, probably possessed of heavy cavalry and ample elite heavy infantry, supported by archers, crossbowmen, handgunners, and quite possibly even artillery from Newlyn. And standing in opposition to this force would be a ragged, ragtag bunch of half-trained, half-competent, half-literate, half-honest, half-men, whose most ferocious offensive force is a sheep with a short person on its back. It should come, therefore, as no great surprise that the resultant clash between the two armies was the singularly most successful battle in the Averland army's entire history, with injuries varying in severity from a soldier who received a literal flesh wound after a lucky arrow penetrated in between two pieces of plate armor and then stuck a millimeter or so into flesh after getting through some padded cloth. And all the way up to really serious wounds like a twisted ankle, for example, suffered by a state trooper whilst he was chasing down hordes of fleeing, screaming midgets. The greatest damage suffered by the invaders that day was not physical, but rather spiritual, as it does indeed put a stern toll on the human mind to mercilessly butcher vast quantities of fat children incapable of even the most rudimentary of resistance. Seriously, it is a quite strident mental toll to have to snap the neck of a screaming pygmy as it cries and pisses itself. I'm not even kidding, as Despite their stunning victory, Marius Leitdorf's army grew smaller and smaller the further it penetrated into the Mootlands. Not due to any sort of organized resistance, or even due to ambushes carried out by Halfling militia waging a guerrilla war upon the invaders, but simply because the soldiers grew so thoroughly disgusted with how perversely easy this all was that they started deserting en masse, deeming this to be a deeply and self-evidently immoral act. Marius himself did not appear to share his troops' misgivings, however, as he was frequently found stalking the various fields in the middle of the night, shouting challenges to imaginary halfling partisans that usually turned out to be trees or bushes, branches even, and then laying into them with his rune fang. The elders of the Moot, having witnessed the absolute brutalistic massacre of their army, retreated as quickly as they could away from the enraged Marius, and urged everyone else to do the same, whilst frantically sending missives for aid to anyone and everyone they thought would even have an iota chance of listening. And they did receive a couple of responses. See, this is where we're going to get a little bit speculatory, because the story doesn't outright state much of this, but there are some very interesting happenstances that occurred that seems to make a degree of sense here. So, the elders of the Moot, apparently not particularly pleased with the consequences of their own actions, requested some of their most famous foreign citizens to return, like Lumpen Crook and his fighting cooks. Remember when I mentioned that the most elite parts of the Halfling army were chefs? Well, these chefs took their secondary vocation of warfare on the road as a mercenary band, where they would, of course, primarily supply an army with foodstuff and other such support, but they would also go to war with their bows. No one would ever accuse the fighting cooks of being the finest fighting force amongst mercenary kind, but they are better than most halflings. And returning to aid the Moot in its time of need, they also happened to join forces with a band of ogres. See, there was a group of ogres that had previously abducted a significant number of halflings whilst wandering through the Moot, offering their services as mercenaries. Normally, of course, an ogre would simply view a halfling as a light and largely unsatisfying snack. Due to this assessment of the halfling's nutritional value, the desperate stunties managed to convince the ogres that they would be better chefs than ingredients. Dubious as to the veracity of this claim, as ogres just tend to eat anything and everything regardless of flavor, they nevertheless elected to give the tiny little gnomes an opportunity, a chance to avoid the pot by filling the pot with something else. And as making food is one of the hairy-toed little savages' one and only actual talents, they managed to do just that, earning them a great deal of favor from their new ogre masters, who adopted them into their tribes as especially favored nobler equivalents. They would carry out little odd bits and bobs and tasks and ends here and there, as well as making food for the ogres, knowing full well that if they ever failed to serve up an adequate meal, then the small folk would find themselves boiling instead. But having now realized that the supply of tiny people might be endangered, the tyrant Blout Feastmaster made full speed for the Moot. And these forces alone would probably not have been enough to stop even the weakened forces of Averland. But the Mootlands were also aided by a third force, a rather unexpected one, the army of Altdorf, dispatched by Karl Franz himself, at the time merely the elector count of Altdorf. However, he was one of the contenders for the imperial throne, and evidently saw this as an opportunity to demonstrate his ability to enforce his will on other imperial provinces. And nobody was really going to yell at him for reining in Marius Leitdorf's mass slaughter of the tiny people. There was some skirmishes between the Averland forces and the Halflings, ogres, and Lumpenkrupp's fighting cooks, but it didn't really amount to much, as neither force really had that much in the way of numbers, or really a will to fight as far as the Averlanders were concerned. However, at long last, the bridge was finished, as Marius made damn sure that its construction took the absolute foremost priority. And it was done just in time for the Altdorf armies to arrive. This was the crucial point, as if the Averlanders continued to resist, then this would become a proper conflict between proper imperial states, rather than merely a punishment of the tiny little disgusting hell-dwelling shits. However, Marius offered no resistance. He agreed to abandon his campaign in the Mootlands so long as his troops were allowed to continue to offer assistance to Stirland. Altdorf, of course, had no real reason to refuse, so long as no further impositions were made upon the halfling populace. Altdorf also did not wish to actually prosecute Marius Leitdorf for any potential crimes he may have committed against the big-toed people, for the simple reason that Marius Leitdorf was Karl Franz's very first supporter in his rush for the throne. Marius Leitdorf had declared himself a supporter of Karl Franz as the emperor before anyone, and was the only one out of the elector counts to vote for him without any promises being made in the first round of voting, which ended up inconclusive, with nobody gaining the right to sit the throne of Sigmar. Although Boris Todbringer got by far the closest with 8 votes, meaning that he was only 2 votes short of being elected. It looked pretty much impossible for Karl Franz to have any hopes of ever being elected. But as nobody had won, they would convene in 2 weeks to vote again. During this time, Marius Leitdorf reached out to the halfling elder Hisme Stoutheart, who was the elector count of the Mootlands. The Mootlands rarely vote strategically, and nobody can ever truly know where their loyalties lies in these political matters, because the halflings themselves don't really know half the time who they're voting for or why. Now, you would think that this would be a strange invitation from the man who had so recently attempted to eradicate all of the tiny people from the world. But it came with an additional invitation as well, from Karl Franz. The 3 would meet in secret in an inn. That was one of the first mistakes, incidentally, as the elder immediately pointed out that it was considered a grave insult amongst his kind to be invited to dinner without there actually being any plans for, eating. As to the others, this was intended to be a negotiation for the elector count's vote, to Stoutheart, it was an invitation to go out and eat. Halflings. Anyways, the halfling elder maintained that his support was entirely for Boris Todbringer, and that he would make a fine emperor, probably because he wasn't going to involve himself over much in the Moot's affairs, being on the other side of the empire and everything. But Marius had learned a thing or two about how halflings ticked during his whole business of attempting to get rid of all of them from the planet. And so, during a brief moment where Karl Franz excused himself to go and have some fresh air, clearly exhausted by the fact that this was going nowhere, and with his ambitions for the imperial throne looking further away than ever before, Marius Leitdorf leaned in to the halfling elder and whispered, "The next time I visit, you'll find that Mittenheim is much further away than Altdorf." And by the time Karl Franz returned to his dining companions, he found his Stoutheart was much, much more receptive to the idea of Emperor Karl Franz, though he did still have a demand, and that demand was for a massive tariff to be placed on all trade that ran along the River Ster. Meaning that all the valuable trades of wool, mutton, beer, agricultural produce, etc., that would normally have been provided to the rest of the empire via Ostland would now find a far, far cheaper road to travel up the river Ava, whose winding path, of course, ran through Stirland, Averland, and the Moot, leaving those three provinces the massive winners of exactly such a tariff. My, how very, very convenient for everyone involved. And that is how Karl Franz became the emperor, and how it was proven yet again that Marius Leitdorf maybe isn't quite as crazy as everyone thinks he is, as he was left sitting pretty with a brand new emperor of his choosing, a fresh set of roads, a brand new bridge, and a massive tariff on his primary competitors. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.